thing I hate when I come to these events is when the person's moderator talks too much, so I'll just keep it really short. 2 years ago, I was looking at, John Cass and I produce a podcast on marketing agility podcast to talk to people about who marketers are using Agile. And Mike was one of the first people we talked to. He was actually podcast number 6 in November of 2011. Back when really no one was talking about Agile in marketing, and a lot of marketers hadn't even a clue about what the word Agile meant, other than their CMO would often say, we need to be more Agile, which is code for we need to move faster. Anyways, we interviewed Mike. He had been practicing Agile as, among many other innovative things they do here at Hubspot, and had some interesting stuff to share. So the great thing about it, Mike's going to share some of the really kind of not nitty-gritty, nuts and bolts, kind of tactical, practical stuff they're doing, real stuff they're doing around Agile tonight. So without that, I'd like to introduce Mike Volpe.
I have very little formal prepared, which you guys should be happy about. So I'm just going to talk a little bit. I really want to make this like interactive and more of a discussion. So if you guys have questions, like throw your hand up. Like let's make it more interactive. Some of the reasons why we first got started with doing Agile marketing, and I think a lot of you can probably relate to this. Like, how many of you have the feeling that, or people in marketing that you work with say, no one knows what we do? Right? Like, no one in the company knows what we do, right? Or everyone else in the company thinks they can do marketing better than we're doing right now, right? That's the other thing that happens. Of course, everyone can just do marketing. Or people ask us to do stuff without telling us that there's something that we're currently working on that we don't have to do anymore, right? It's always just like people ask for more and more stuff. Or that, you feel so overwhelmed with requests that merely dealing with the number of requests you're getting from everyone in sales and everyone in the product team and like all these different places in the company, just dealing with all those requests for things that you need to do is overwhelming your ability to actually get anything done in the first place. So it's just like the number of requests coming in are like so high, and people want responses to stuff where you're not even able to actually make any product move forward on any of them. It's like you're sort of like paralyzed by that. Or you have this feeling that you have a really hard time finishing things because new stuff always comes up. So it's like you're in the middle of like writing an ebook or doing whatever this particular marketing project is, and a bunch of new things come in, and you need to put that down and like start something else. Or people have this feeling that like marketing doesn't do anything, right? That's the other thing that I think people run into a lot. So I started Hubspot almost 7 years ago, about 6.5 years ago, and I was the 5th employee. And back then it was easy because we all sat in this tiny room, we all knew what everyone was doing, and everything worked great. Then you start to grow, and you start to grow, and we sort of got to the point where the marketing team was kind of between probably 8 or 10 people, and we started to run into a lot of those problems that I was talking about, where everyone else in the company thought they could do a better job marketing. No one really sort of understood what we were doing. People were just like asking stuff from us. And we were just like, we had no ability to get even close to the number of things done that everyone in the company wanted from marketing. And so I was having all these problems. And about a year before then, maybe 6 months, between 6 months and a year before then, our development team had actually implemented Agile, and we've gone like strict Agile, like very, very to the book Agile in terms of building our software, building our product. And so I took our VP of engineering out to lunch, and I was like, I feel like, and I listed off all the problems I was having, you guys encountered these problems, and then you did this thing, and it seems like it's a lot better now. And he was like, yes. I was like, I think we could do that in marketing. And we chatted about it for a little while over lunch, and it was sort of like, yeah, like maybe it's worth a shot. And so we started doing it. And what I'll tell you is that it wasn't necessarily easy in the early days, but it had a ton of benefits, and the major benefits for us were it provided a ton more visibility and transparency. So like the entire company, like literally the entire company, at that time was probably 50 people or something like that. The entire company actually knew what the hell we were doing. They had some idea what we were doing and what our priorities were. It increased our throughput a lot, so it increased actually our productivity a lot. Like the amount of stuff we were getting done with the same size team increased. And it gave us a lot more flexibility. And it also gave us a lot of, I think for the employees, the people on the team, much more clarity around what was important and what was more important than other things, so what they needed to focus on. So all those things I think worked really, really well. And I think it really did change the relationship of marketing with the rest of the company. So that I think was awesome. So a couple things. One is we actually wrote an article, blog article, surprisingly enough, I thought that we wrote a blog article about this. And there's also a SlideShare embedded, which is also here. So if you want to read a little bit more about some of this stuff, you can Google this title and you'll find it. Or on SlideShare, it's Agile for Marketing, and that gives you a little bit more. But I also wanted to share a couple, some of the artifacts of this. So there's a bunch of tools we use internally. The wiki, which is this product from Atlassian, Confluence from Atlassian, is one of the big internal tools at Hubspot. You can see this page was last edited by me in May 2009, and this is our sprint A. This is the first sprint we ever did. This is the first agile marketing attempt at HubSpot. So I've dusted off this page, dug it up from the archives. I'm sure this page probably hasn't been served from the server in a very long time. But this is what the first one looked like. And I don't know if this is pretty. I think there's a lot of things we started doing better over time. But you'll see okay, here's all the stuff Ellie. And we just did this by person because the team was relatively small back then. So here's all the stuff Ellie had to do. And you'll notice that I had to do a bunch of stuff, but I get pulled in all these management tasks, so I had to do a terrible job of finishing things. So I started actually, reduce the amount of time I was spending in sprint activities over time, and now I spend 0 because I have to manage all day, and it sucks. So Pamela, she had some stuff to do. Sean, Rebecca, Rick, and I guess actually at that time that was the whole team. So so that's basically what it looked like. And then we actually started to do a review. This review was super quick, and we just sort of a review things we learned, fine, whatever. But this is what I think is really, really cool. So there's a comment on our wiki page. This is the CEO and co-founder Brian Halligan, and he's I'm really glad you guys are doing this. I think it'll help keep the company on the same page, increase, and it's exactly, this is exactly why you do Agile, I think. And so it's really clear that it was awesome that my boss got this relatively quickly. And by the way, so this actually gives the original data page. So he commented in December 2008 because we actually started at the end of 2008. So I must have gone and edited this page later. I was probably changing that issues. Then we keep going. Maybe I'll show the other thing we started to do. So this is from Sprint B. So the second sprint we ever did. I'll go through this really quickly. But we started to do this presentation, and we actually invited. It wasn't mandatory, but we actually invited the whole company to come. And we started to do a review of, we call it a marketing science fair, where we started to do a review of all the stuff we did in the sprint. And it gave people on the team an opportunity to talk about the things that they had done, share a little bit of what our team had done, have a little bit of discussion, and then people could find the individual people that had worked on stuff and talk to them afterwards and say, oh, okay, I saw you wrote those 3 blog articles. Why did you do that? How did that work? Or oh, what are you going to do next month? Things like that. So we had a section I presented about how I failed to do anything effective. And then, other people like Rashawn would say, I totally kicked ass and all these things. And this stuff is completely out of date and totally not relevant to our business anymore because it's from years and years ago. But here you go. It's there's a whole bunch of things that he did, and then here's the stuff that Rick did. He clearly must have done a pretty good job. Here's some horribly, terribly ugly screenshots for software from 4 years ago. It looks a million times better today. All kinds of stuff. Some people report on some results, whatever. And this stuff changed and morphed a lot over time. But we would start to report out, and then these slides would start to get posted on the wiki. From there, so this is A, then we work our way up to Sprint G, and you start to see these things. A, there's more people on the team. B, there's sort of maybe a little bit more sophistication, and then you start to get hey, this is great too. So it's much better as a marketer if your boss and other important people in the company have some idea what you're doing, and then you get this feedback, and it's oh, so whatever that, there must be something in here about doing your homepage design or whatever. It's it'd be great if whatever this is really, really good to know, right? Versus trying to email Brian and send him the list of stuff we're doing, he's never going to read that. But for some reason, internally in our culture, by doing the sprint and then having all the things posted on the wiki, he will actually read that page in the middle of the night, and then he'll comment on it, and great, that's really good feedback, and it's good feedback to go to the person who's working on that. So that's really cool. And then, here's I, so it's a little more, and then here's another one. It's hey, Jordan, you should check out OnForce. So whatever project, Jordan's working on, maybe it's something to do on OnForce, and she should check it out. So what was she? Yes, so she's testing this thing on the service marketplace. So great. And then it keeps going. And then what we ended up doing, we switched. So we originally started by naming our sprints letters because our development team was naming theirs numbers, and we wanted differentiation between the two. But then what we ended up doing was saying, okay, well, let's align with them. And we actually did a combined product and marketing science fair at the end of the month. So the product team would present some stuff, and we would present some stuff. And then what we ended up doing was renaming our sprints numbers, but rather having us have one, us call ours number 15, and they were already ahead of us, they were on number 30 or whatever. We actually just adopted their numbering system, so we did the same thing. And then you start to see here, it starts to work by teams, actually. So we have, at this time, the team was like, this is later, and the whole marketing team was larger. So we had one team called the Giraffes, the Orcas, and the interns team, and then, whatever, people like goofy names. I won't go into the Hubspot culture as to why those names exist, but just trust me, there was a team called the Giraffes, and they did do stuff with animals all day. And here's what they did, right? And you see different people, different names of different people on the same team. And then you start to see, again, the user stories start to get maybe a little bit more sophisticated. You might argue that some of the stuff isn't maybe necessarily strict Agile, but, this is what we're doing. And there's a bunch of stuff here, and then you scroll down, and then, oh great, here's what the Orcas, and here's what they're doing, right? Et cetera, et cetera. And during the course of the month, they're keeping this status column updated. Obviously now, most of them are either done or they logged on it. And we have, a whole list of all these things here that are starting to happen. And then we would actually do also report out at the end of the month too. So we're still doing the science fairs at that time. Now,
month-long sprints?
Yeah, so we did month-long. Most of the time that we were doing Agile here, we did month-long. We did a couple teams started doing some experiments of 2-week sprints, and that seemed to work okay, but it felt like the planning overhead was a little bit much, like the ratio of the amount of planning versus the amount of working for 2 weeks didn't really work for us. So most of the time we've done month-long sprints. A lot of that, though, is we run the whole company monthly, like we have monthly sales quotas, like there is this monthly heartbeat at Hubspot, so I think that's one of the reasons why it works well for us. But monthly seemed to be, for us, most of the time about the right kind of cadence.
How often do you actually present and do your show and tell? How often do you
Same cadence as the sprints.
Really?
Yes, so it was monthly. And again, I'm talking about the first couple years we were doing Agile. I'll fast forward and tell you some of the differences that happened over time.
Okay.
But at this time period, and again, at this point, the marketing team is probably maybe 15-ish people. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So, yeah, maybe 15 people or so at that point in time. So it's getting to be a decent-sized team. Yeah.
I'm actually on the sales side, so where's the interaction with what you're doing with Agile and the sprints and linking it to this? I thought it was interesting that you linked it to the product side.
In terms of the cadence by which we worked, it was more with the product team. But in terms of what we're doing, heavy alignment with sales.
So
right?
were they involved in all of the presentations and things like that as well?
So they weren't. Yes, the way we did it, they weren't involved in the presentations. Our sales team, it wasn't like they weren't. Mostly, they weren't doing it like they just had to hit their number, right? So it's like their sprint task is like hit the number, and at the end of the month, it's like did you hit the number or not? And there's a presentation, pretty much, right? I know it's more than that. But where they really came in was we would do a lot of work in the planning process with them in terms of what the prioritization of the marketing tasks were and what we needed to do to help them hit their goal. They would also, our backlog was public and anyone could submit stuff to our backlog. So a lot of the sales reps would say, I really need a piece of collateral that does Y, or I really want a video that does this other thing, or whatever. So they were constantly giving us projects. And then we had to work with them and the sales management in terms of prioritizing, you ask for 40 things, we can do 3, what are the three most important things? And I do think that transparency was really effective with sales, where we would say, here's the stuff we're doing this month, here's why, here's the prioritization, and then as an individual sales rep that maybe wanted XYZ thing done, you don't feel as bad, because you sort of get that, okay, the marketing team was doing a lot of stuff, they didn't pick my thing, but I kind of see the things that are working are important. So I think the transparency with sales is effective, and giving them a good place to put all their ideas. Mm-hmm. So as a marketer, the thing that's great about this is that you have an outlet for all this creativity and all these ideas throughout the entire company of why they all think they can do marketing better than you. And you have this great, you're put it in the backlog and then we'll go through it and we'll evaluate it. As opposed to coming up to me and I sort of say, that's an interesting idea. And you take that as code for go fuck yourself, I'm never going to do it. Which is usually true. This is this you feel like you're, you filed a support ticket and like we may not fix that bug, but it's been logged in the system. You feel better about it. Yeah. So I think this helps a lot with sales.
Did the planning of your sprint overlap with the delivery of the sprint, or was it the case where it's like this sprint is done, now we're going to plan and deliver the next sprint?
Yes, but that interim period was like 2 days.
Okay.
So we tried to make it like relatively fast. And I don't know if that's right or wrong. I think people sometimes do that a little differently, but for us, and I would say the person running each team would need to do a little bit of thinking ahead of time, but like the true like actual planning of like sitting down, looking at the backlog and figuring out what we're going to do the next one. We would end the sprint, and then that afternoon and the next morning it was like figuring all that stuff out, and then the next one would start. That was at least the way we did it. Yeah.
I saw in your earlier one you had hours, and I noticed in here you got story points.
Yeah.
Is this how nervous are you in terms of planning over versus just size?
We started I think the first one we did is like I don't know, maybe it's all the analytical folks in the marketing team that like I hire kind of my old mold. What's a story point? What's the translation? So we just said, okay, we're just gonna we have some idea how many hours a project takes. We just use that as our currency. We started to shift over to story points. I don't know that we've ever done a good job of estimating, nor a good job of quantifying the quantity of points or the volume of work that someone can deliver in a month. I think we've always been terrible at that. I think many Agile teams actually say that too, though. But yeah, I don't think we've ever figured that out at all. And I'm actually curious. I forget what we're doing now on some of the teams, so I'll be curious to like click over to what we're doing today on some of the teams and see even if they have that currency anymore. I think I don't even know. That'll be interesting. Now we do a really crappy job of that.
Well, it seems like most of the people I talk to are practicing in the same level.
Yeah.
Very few people are.
It doesn't seem like people figured that out.
The benefits of transparency, the one big backlog,
Yeah.
Science, presentation, and all that is such a huge step improvement for people that the dogma of having story points and planning over is.
And what I always encourage my teams were, it was like, okay, like put less things in your commitment, and then you know what? Like culturally, I feel like everyone works really hard, and if you finish ahead of time, great. There's this whole backlog. You just grab something off the top of it and like go do that. Versus mentally, I feel like if you commit to whatever amount of stuff and then you don't get to it, that's much more of a bummer and a big letdown versus like finishing and then grabbing more. And as long as you have a nice pile of stuff to grab more from and like the top portion of your backlog is relatively well prioritized, I feel like that works, right? So I'm not sure that the estimation, getting that super accurate, is that important. And we've never figured that out. Over the years, we just never figured out the problem.
And how are your teams organized? I know it's maybe a little bit tangential, but I'm curious.
Well, different ways over different times. The first one, it was like, there were like 4 or 5 people that worked for me, right? And they had different skills, like at least kind of more of a little bit more of a generalist. I'm completely useless. Pamela was her content person. Prashant was more of an ops analytical person. Repcore was a little bit more of a content person. Rick was more senior, a little bit more of a content person. So we would just sort of assign stuff out to them based on kind of skill set. If you fast forward through, to here, we have these different teams. So the drafts is actually, it's G, so it's code for the get found team. So they were kind of more of a top of the funnel team. I forget, the org has had some weird thing as to why. They're basically a middle of the funnel team. I don't know, the interns, I guess, planned our parties or something. We had a small team that did work with our agency partners. This is Puma's product marketing, and this is a one-person team. I won't explain that name. She had a fish. She kept having fish in the office, and they kept dying. She basically killed a lot. She kept trying to have pet fish in the office, and they just kept dying and dying and dying. And finally, she just said, I'm just name my team after the fate of the fish was like the 4 of them died, rather than actually killing more fish. So I guess I want to do this. But anyway, yeah. So we basically had a top of the funnel, middle of the funnel product marketing, which is not that dissimilar, to what we actually have today for those of you that read up on our stuff.
Did you try to account for your marketing ops as part of the Agile?
Yeah, again, this is like, all this that I've shown so far is like really early on. And so the marketing ops side is pretty lightweight. I don't actually think our current marketing ops team uses Agile, to how I let or don't let the teams do different stuff. But I think it could work well. I think it could work really well for marketing ops because a lot of those projects tend to be a little bit more like development centric. And I think if it works for software development, it should work for marketing ops. But for us, like there's no like dedicated ops team here. I guess the closest thing would have been that middle of the funnel. Like we should look and see what they have that month. So tweaking the lead algorithm actually, and this was actually this is programming that into Salesforce. So that's kind of a marketing ops thing. And one of these is probably like a reporting thing. That's all promotion, lead gen planning. Yeah, okay, so this is like some investigation in terms of like the number of leads and stuff like that. PPC. Oh yeah, here we go. So great. So this is like at the time, Hubspot didn't have email, so we were using something else. And like here's something we using training setup. So yeah, there was some off stuff mixed into one of these teams.
It looks like your one has stories too. As a HubSpot.
Yeah, some teams are better. I mean, yes. I go back and forth into whether or not I think for product this makes a lot of sense. I think for other roles, I don't know. We never really got awesome. This is like an attempt at it, but I don't know if that would. I don't know. For product, I think it's important. Yeah.
I noticed that none of the stories are really tied to a certain date, but on the content side, you might want to stay relevant, obviously, to whatever's going on. How did you build that into a month-long plan to be able to have sort of that?
Yeah, so what we built, I don't know if it's in this one. At one point, what we started doing was we would say, the content team would, okay, so this is a good example. So 10 breaking news blog posts. So this is over the course of a month. So during that time, it's like we wanted to have 10 blog posts that were about breaking news. I can't tell you today what the breaking news is going to be 2 weeks from now, but I can tell you that what this team is committing to is we're going to write 10 breaking news blog posts. So over the course of the month, they didn't borrow their news and then try to do some news jacking and publish something about that. So I think that's basically like how we tried to handle it. I don't know if that's perfect or not, but you're right, yeah. And even some of these they wouldn't be here's one. It's 3 cartoon blog posts, and we don't know what the cartoons are, but over this month, you're going to figure all that out. Yeah. Some of it will be tied to individual dates. Like this webinar, we probably knew the date of it. So technically it needs to get done during that sprint, but likely it has to get done in the next 2 weeks, not the next 30 days, because it's the webinar. And I guess, maybe we're a little soft on some of that stuff, but yeah. All right, so let's fast forward a little bit. So then we got to this point where I feel like having done Agile somewhat strictly for a while changed the culture of the team a fair amount. And we got much better at communicating, collaborating with others. We got much better at all the benefits from Agile started to go really well. And I basically completely backed off, and I basically let the teams kind of do what they want. And it actually worked okay. And a bunch of them started to get a little softer. And this I think was maybe sort of the peak of us being somewhat strict about this stuff. And what we started doing from there was I kind of just backed off and sort of let the teams kind of determine a little bit more of what they do and what they don't do. Then fast forward a couple more years to get to approximately today. And some parts of my team, so the marketing team now is 60 people. There's 5 in Dublin, the rest are here in Cambridge. And I've got 3 directors that work for me that each manage, varying portions of the team. And then they each have sub-teams that break down into groups of anywhere from 2 or 3 to maybe 6 or 7 on the bigger end. And each of those sub-teams can do whatever they want. A lot of them don't do Agile anymore. Some of them do. And here's an example of one. So the inbound funnel team, which is one of our teams. And this is actually, they're a little bit bigger. And what they actually do now, so they're, so we started this team at a certain point, and here's, their team meeting decks. But here you go. It's they have a sprint, they have a sprint review, they have a sprint, and a sprint review. So this team is actually, still somewhat strict. Ellie's a big fan of this stuff, and she does it a lot. So, here they go. So here's their November 13th sprint. So they have a goal of certain number of leads, so listing out who's in the office, who's not in the office, things like that. They've got a couple of part-timers that are interns and things like that. And then bang, like here's their project list, and I figured out how to use this cool checkboxy thing within the wiki, so that's like a big major technology update. And here you go. They've got some collaboration with the projects, and again, this is see they're not written as user stories anymore, etc. But you still have that same amount of transparency. You have the same notion of who's working on what. I can come in here at any time and see a status update of what people have done and haven't done, and where they're at. I can give them feedback on individual projects and stuff like that. So I feel like this works relatively well. But there's other parts of the team that don't do this at all, and I'm actually cool with that. I think that at this point in time, I'm not sure that I should be dictating as much the structure of how these individual teams work. I've delegated a lot more of that to other folks that manage the team. If that's right or wrong, I don't know, but it's not really my style. This is too much of a team for this size. So it's definitely evolved, but I would say that this is the portion of the team that's sort of the most aggressive in Agile today. Yeah, Scott.
Do you have a sense as to why some teams chose to do it or not to do it?
Culture. So Ellie has been here forever. She's the first person I hired, so she went through this whole Agile thing. And I think it fits her personality, and she really likes it. And actually, I was actually surprised to find this on the wiki because they, for a little while, were using Trello, and there's a couple other portions of our team that use Trello too to track their stuff today. So I think it boils down to personality of the team and personality of the leader of the team. There's another team that functions. I think some of the teams that are maybe smaller do it maybe a little bit less. I think some of the teams that are have less dependencies and other teams maybe do it a little bit less. I think some of the teams that, we have an internal creative agency, creative services team. They do it a little bit, but yeah, that's one where maybe I should make them do it a little bit more. I think it mostly boils down now that I think about it, I should write that down. I think it mostly boils down to the personality of the team and personality of the manager is my guess. I don't know. That's a good question. I should think about that one more.
So I run product management and marketing, and so one of the things that I see very different between teams is engineering. I have very clear ways of measuring done that involve metrics, that involve being able to measure a certain level of quality, things like that. Whereas marketing, the only real notion I have of done immediately is did I complete the deliverable, did I complete the activity? The measurement trails a lot further. Did this campaign that we just launched, did this content result in the type of click-through rate that we want? And much smaller than you guys have. So we're measuring each thing much more with much more scrutiny than you are. But how do you introduce the notion of that measurement feedback or that measurement notion to how you guys do Agile?
So, I'll answer the question in a couple ways. I'm not sure that the marketing version of done is that different than the product version of done. Certainly you can ship a feature, but I think that to know if the feature was good or bad, and what there's always this what does done mean in Agile, right? Does done mean you hit the button and shipped it? Kind of, but if you ship a total piece of shit, either a crappy ebook or a crappy code, a crappy new product, I think they're both equivalent to a bad thing to do. And I actually think in some cases it takes longer to get feedback on the product side, depending on how you think about your marketing. So we think about our marketing less in things like quarter-long campaigns and more in terms of each individual piece. So a blog article, I get feedback in 24 hours or less as to whether or not that's successful. Ebooks maybe take a couple days from when they launch and get promoted, but it's not that much time. I actually think that in terms of product, it could take longer. I think it can take a couple weeks to get customers to start to use something, see what usage patterns are like, see what bug reports are like, see how sales embraces it, can they sell it, all that stuff. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. I actually think that there's anyway. So I'm not sure that the difference is necessarily that big, but we're a very analytical culture, and we have analytical goals. And the goal of marketing is not to do a bunch of activity and just ship a bunch of stuff. The real goal is to drive leads to sales, right? And so we also have goals, and you see even in that marketing, this one right here, this one right here, they've got a goal for X number of leads, right? And And sometimes we used to have like a thing like generate X number of leads, right? And actually, if you even look at one of these, was this one? Yeah, this one. So for some of these, what we started to do at one point in time was actually break it down. And we said, okay, well, here's the target and then the actual, so we could actually see. So this is great. So it's like you target 3,000, we actually got 6,000 leads off of it. Awesome. So, some of these we obviously didn't update because we got to be lazy. But we were trying to break it down into individual things and having a goal for each one. But obviously, like you said, it takes a little while for that number to actually roll in. What we ended up doing was we sort of run Agile is basically, you can think about it as a method for getting things done and running the activity. And then, but separately from that, we have a reporting on results. So we would also, in our science fair, have like a separate section, which is like, okay, our goal was X and we did Y, and that's either good or bad from whatever. And other meetings where we report that. So I don't know that we ended up really integrating that well into Agile. It's sort of something that runs a little separate, a little parallel. And I think that the manager's jobs, my job, is to pick the right projects to get executed on in the Agile process to make sure that we're doing the right things so we can actually hit those lead gen goals. I think is one way to think about it. Go for it.
Yeah, coming from the perspective of being involved in Agile for software development, there were two things I'm interested in to hear your perspective on.
Yeah.
One is the transparency. One of our most critical tools was the burn down charts.
Yeah.
So within a sprint, maybe by 10 or 20% within a sprint, we could see if we were lagging in what way to take corrective action so that we finish on time. Pretty fine grained. Any sort of equivalent transparency within a sprint, or you basically had so many things going on and then at the end you figured out how to be estimated and do them?
We tried to do the burn down charts.
It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work.
And we tried to do it, and it was a lot of work, and it never worked for us. Our development team, when they were strict, they're not anymore. When they were strict Agile years ago, they had burn down charts, and you could see it. And I always thought it was really cool because you'd start to see them go like totally sideways, and you're like, dude, like, what's up? Yeah, no, totally, exactly. We just never figured out. I think because again, I think the tools, especially back then, were a little bit better for developers. So they would use Jira, which had this like Agile thing built in, which is part of Atlassian, right? And so they also had to integrate with the wiki and other stuff. So they would actually have specific tasks with like amounts assigned to them and things like that. And we just never really figured out how to use Jira in a way that made us happy to use it. Maybe just because we're small-minded marketers, but so we never got to the point that a couple teams did and actually use Jira for a couple months, but it just never really stuck. It was just too much overhead, too much pain in the ass for us. So we never really had success there. So what would happen is you get into a sprint, and I would sort of check in with the teams a little bit, and then you sort of partway through the sprint, it's like all of a sudden something's like crossed off, like to the next sprint. Like you would sort of punt some projects.
Yeah. So in a way, your penalties for missing were probably lower than the software team's penalties for missing. And usually,
what do you see as like the penalty with the software team missing?
Well, if you made customer commitments to deliver a feature and you miss those commitments, then you usually have pretty implicit results from your customers in the market.
Yeah.
And your management staff.
But like and you're sort of saying that people see that more because it's a public burn down, or?
Well, the management team
Yeah.
will look at the burn down charts in order to take corrective actions.
Yeah.
So we would constantly use those tools. And
what are the corrective actions? I think the corrective actions are usually making projects smaller, right? And punting functionality to future sprints.
So sometimes we would move people around or borrow people from a less critical resource.
Oh,
and
that's interesting.
Have them focus, or we prioritize and say maybe we didn't get this right.
Okay.
Any of those are.
So that's interesting. So I always felt like if the burn down starts to go sideways, the way you catch up is you punt some stuff to like you basically reduce your scope. And that's at least the way we used to do it. We would never, and maybe we were doing it wrong, but we would never move engineers around and be like, oh crap, this team needs help this month. We just never did that. So that's interesting. You guys approach it very
So that comes to my second
Yeah.
question, which is interdependency between people. Which on the engineering side, which would often blow up a sprint, as if somebody didn't perform or the task turned out to be way too hard and they didn't understand it. Do you find that the marketing teams have that kind of interdependency, or is it really?
Some. I think one of the things that works worked well for us that we found over time is like the fewer dependencies you can have, like the better, right? Okay, so you're like, yeah, genius, I'm an engineer, I know that. And what we tried to do is be really clear that like when there was a dependency, and tried in the planning process to be really clear with folks that like whoever the dependency was on, that they actually had the same task and they had a good number of points assigned to it, so it seemed like there was likelihood that it would get done. And then of course the person running the team, like their job is like when someone has a blocker, their job is to try to do their best to unblock the blocker, right? And so we tried. I don't know that we were really awesome on that, but I think at least in the planning process, surfacing that you depend on someone else for something, and then checking with either within your team if they have points assigned to that project, or if they're on another team that they have, you know, a project and points assigned to that, definitely like absolutely helped a lot. Versus other times before this whole, you know, more strict planning process, you know, I would go to a month being like, oh, this is like my sort of list of stuff I'm going to do this month, and I wouldn't even have support for your thing on my list at all. So I do think this is better than not doing it, but it's definitely not perfect, like when you're talking about absolutely having a marketing too.
So that's probably the bottom line that we found in software as well, which is problems got exposed very early on.
Yes.
So you can deal with them.
Yes, I think that's a really good way, totally right way to phrase it. Yeah. Yeah.
Let me ask a sideways question. One of the things that in my discussion with people about taking up Agile sometimes came up was, yeah, we have metrics for whether a particular job gets done well or not. But you know, over time the process changes because you find certain parts of it don't work. Are there kind of indicators, you know, in the process itself, like are we doing too many pivots? Do we never get to an epic? We're always doing little bitty stories. Were there indicators in your experience?
I think one of the big indicators for us that things like were not being run well was if like the percentage of projects or sprint tasks or user stories that were in a given sprint, like the percentage that were actually completed was relatively low, or the percentage that ended up not being completed was higher. Right? I always used to push my team a lot on that because if you're not gonna really make a firm commitment to do the things that are on your task list for that sprint, you might as well do something else, like more like unvarnished process or whatever, where you just have this prioritized backlog and you just like as you finish stuff you just pull new things, which is different than Agile, right? Where Agile you're kind of doing things is like, okay, I'm gonna work on this stuff, then I'm gonna work on this stuff, that was one thing that I felt like the process breaking down, because then the transparency of the company doesn't mean that much, because you're saying at the beginning of the month, like, oh, we're going to do all these things, and if you only do this many, then like, oh, no, you're not really the next month. You say, oh, we're going to do these things. So like, no, you're fucking not. Like, it's not true, right? So I always told them, like, again, like, get down closer to what we're actually really, really going to do, and you're much better off pulling one or two new things in. So I think that's probably one of the things that started to break a lot. Because the whole transparency and the communication of the company starts to break down if you're just unrealistic about what you'll get done. And I'm trying to think, I think it's probably made the big thing. I made both things.
For a typical person, when you were in the middle of doing this, what percentage of your job would have fallen into the stuff that was in a sprint? Like
so that's a good. So the interesting thing is that I think more so for marketing versus developers, a lot of our activity is just like ongoing. And I think in one of these things, one of the slides or whatever, we had this whole like discussion up there about, participate in social media, right? How many story points is that? And like, is that ever going to end? Like, no, like it never ends, right? Or, I don't know, answer speaking requests or emails to the media@hubspot.com account or like stuff like that. So for some people on the team, we would carve out a fair amount, like sometimes half of their time or more, to just like ongoing things that And at some point in our history, we used to like list like an ongoing task like within their sprint list to make them feel good that they were doing something. But then at other points, we're just like, that's not really like, it's just like pull it out there. So I go either way on those, but you absolutely need to allow for that type of activity because in marketing, in my opinion, there's a lot of that type of activity. Now, in software development, there is some of that activity. There's bug fixing, there's like, working on your own development tool set, there's things like that that are kind of more ongoing. Our developers, I think, have had some success back when we used to do Agile of like, doing that stuff in a more time-boxed manner, or maybe every X sprints doing like a big kind of, sprint that was exclusively working on the development tool set or working on bug fixing or things like that. But I think in marketing, there is just a bunch of stuff that you just need to like always be doing. And so the way we mostly approached it was, only having people devote a certain amount of their time to the sprint tasks versus like this ongoing stuff that they would just do all the time. And it would vary by the person depending on what their role is.
Well, do you have a sense of what was kind of the max and the minimum in terms of what they devoted to sprint?
I think the average is probably around half and half, and I think the maximum of someone's time that would be devoted to sprint, sprint tasks or user stories that you've done that sprint would be maybe 75%, and the minimum would be maybe 25% or so. And below that, it's like, why are you here? Not why are you here at the company, but like why are you participating in this process?
Cool.
Yeah, and then so here's an example of the most recent retrospective that we've had. So this is from again this team, and it's like this is them. This is not like a report on the actual sprint, the user stories, but this is kind of like they're like, okay, 3 wins, 3 misses. What they're going to focus on next. This is more like a discussion of like the process and the learnings from it. That's how this team works. Yeah, I think so. It's interesting from my perspective. I don't know if any of you guys know of any like really large organizations that run on very strict Agile. Especially marketing organizations, because again, like we're very patchwork. Like I'm definitely a relatively hands-off manager. And I wonder if it's time to like go strict again, and maybe like we've done a lot of hiring, the team has expanded a lot, and I wonder if there's a couple pockets that maybe I should get more strict with. I don't know. But I think the other thing is I'm not sure that the wiki is the right tool set to do that for me to have effective management of potentially 15 teams, right? So maybe what would that mean? Well, maybe that means I need to force all of the teams to use one specific tool set, and then that would then have roll up of all the sprint tasks among all the teams, and let me have a little bit more visibility and input. And then I sort of start to feel like culturally, like I'm starting to not get very well along with Hubspot. So I don't know. That's yeah. So we don't actually do the science fairs anymore.
Oh, why did you stop?
Why did we stop? The content that we were presenting was not good enough to draw a good audience because there were so many presentations. Like as the team started to get big, it's just like we've 60 people, so we're on the order of kind of 15 teams. Even if each team only has 10 minutes, like how do you cover everything you did in a month on a team of multiple people in like 10 minutes, right? And they started doing the math, like holy crap, like that's like a lot of minutes. And so we never were able to figure that out. If I had an infinite amount of time in my day, what I would maybe do is like go meet with each team individually and try to pull out like the 1 or 2 highlights from their team and craft a really good presentation that I could do in 30 to 40 minutes to the whole company about the awesome stuff that marketing did every month. But I don't know. I've got other things that seem to be occupying my time, and I guess that maybe hasn't ranked up there in terms of importance. So, the transparency is there, but there is definitely today a little bit of an obfuscation by just the amount of it, right? So it's sort of like, it's to some degree obfuscated because how many people are going to go, and like that wiki page is now really long, and that's only 10% of the marketing team, 15% of the marketing team, right? And so it's like, and we have a monthly report. We have a monthly report for each of the individual pieces of the marketing team. So like, there's now a lot. And so one of the things I do worry about is how has that transparency changed? It's like because the transparency is there, but it's there because we're just publishing all the information. It's sort of like when the government just like publishes like a 30,000 page report about something. If no one can really read it and digest it, I do worry today that like, have we lost that transparency? Not because we're not publishing it, but because no one can consume it. So maybe there's some way to boil it down, or I don't know.
How many teams were you at when you stopped doing the science lab? Was it 9?
Yeah, probably on the order of like 8 or something. If I remember right.
What if you had a science fair alternate? So 8 teams, something like that, or 5 teams, 5 teams.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So like,
make
them summarize or something like that. Yeah.
So one month and then one the next.
Yeah.
One set.
Yeah, that could work. That could work.
Have you ever gone to the idea of like some of the bigger companies do this sort of scrums? Yeah, I know that sounds kind of.
Yeah, I've heard about that. I'm not sure I know enough about it.
I
don't know.
know.
Yeah, you already know. Okay. Yeah.
I
know. It's like
history,
right? It just I don't know. That sounds like a lot of process over it. I know it's Agile, but like,
the other thing, we had a really good presentation from David Quinn at EMC because they implemented it, and their approach actually is really interesting because I mean, I see it as an organic approach. So it's like a traditional startup. You started small, you grown to 60, and it's imbibed in the culture and everything else. With EMC, they've got tens of thousands, 50,000 employees or so, and their sets of problems were sort of larger, it was more organizational. So David Quinn talked about how they basically identified that they had these big problems across marketing in the company, and what their team was supposed to do was to build a central team that spread Agile marketing. So the whole purpose of that team, and it's 4 or 5, 6 people, the whole purpose of the team is not to do marketing, it's to spread Agile marketing. So, so it's almost, I mean, they're definitely marketers, but they're doing something different. So it's transforming the business in a way.
Yeah.
Which is just the communications team, though. That's part of the trick. He's just a communications team. Teams are sort of forming, and my understanding is a form whole. It's not like you've got everyone is in a team, right? Well, almost everyone's in a team. I think he's got teams that are kind of starting out and stopping. And it's a bit more dynamic, so it's not quite the same.
Oh, so he's like enlisting people for 2 or 3 sprints in a region, and then they're going back to their day job after that.
Yeah, like not every project's being done every month, and the project kicks up, they rally people around.
Yeah.
Well, no, but he actually started his story off by saying that the real problem was that you had the customers within the company who weren't getting their problems solved by the marketers, and so that was the big problem that they were trying to solve, which you actually mentioned. So it wasn't really, it was more from the customer's perspective, which I think is interesting.
Yeah.
Because, so in some ways, yes, it was the marketers that were doing it, and they were doing it because they were recognizing there was that problem, but it was more the customer side. But he didn't really talk about how they looked across all of the organization, but he did paint a very good picture how over the last couple of years they've certainly made an impact, and through that organic word of mouth across the company, now more and more teams want to start using it.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing that, as I think about it more, I think, for me, it's, and maybe it's a failing of mine and my inability to scale or something like that, but I don't feel like I could do an effective job of reviewing the backlog for even part of the marketing team. Like, there's just 60 people, it's just so much there that like I'm now, I need to operate at this level where it's like, here are the 4 priorities for the marketing team for Q4. And here are the couple high-level projects, and I know like roughly who's working on those projects, and like that's now at like the level at which I'm operating versus like when the whole team was 5 people and they all reported to me. I'm like, what are you doing today, right? And so as the team has grown, I feel like my role has changed a lot and needs to change because I just can't remember those details with my sleeves rolled up all the time. And so I think maybe the thing that I'm kind of struggling with is, even if I were to implement, a really strict Agile process throughout the entire team, but like, am I going to really review the entire backlog for the whole team? I'm not going to do that. It's not going to happen, right? So with EMC, it sounds like maybe it's not all their projects, or it's some of them, or something like that. Like, it's interesting. So I don't know. I feel like we're sort of at that, and we also can't afford to have a 4 or 5 person team that's like organizing Agile for all marketing. So we're sort of this middle level where I feel like my ability to dig into the details is gone because of our scale and size, but we don't have the ability yet to like have people that are dedicated to like running Agile for the team. So maybe we're in this like sort of odd, no man's land in the middle or something. I don't know.
Well,
Maybe I'm just doing it wrong. I don't know.
Well, no, I don't think so. I mean, you may be the first company in your situation in the sense that you may be one of the first ones to get to the point where you've grown large enough that you're hitting those problems.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Having that Agile, right?
Yeah.
Because you're totally right. I mean, you were talking earlier, like when we started back here, like Sprint A, it's like we were this small, like happy little startup, and we had like 2 or 3 product teams that were doing 2 or 3 scrum teams in product. We had 1 in marketing, and like it was great. It was awesome. It worked perfectly. It was awesome. But I think as we've grown, we started running into some other problems.
The only thing that I would maybe suggest is, well, let's go back to the origins. Let's go back to the Agile development people and say, they've been doing it for longer. Why don't we go back to them and say, how have you coped with that? I mean, maybe part of it is that you don't have to have that. You don't have to have that transparency, or the transparency doesn't have to be to the whole company, but you have to figure out where the transparency needs to be proportional.
John, can I make a comment on that? I think sometimes from the software development point of view, there's this whole concept of grouping user stories into epics.
Yeah.
And this sort of, as long as that's there, you can sort of set milestones reviews or major reviews for presentation to the company at the point where there's an epic involved and you've reached a certain milestone. It also makes each group think of in terms of, I'm doing this small project, but it's part of an epic.
Yeah.
Or when the epic reaches a certain point.
Yeah, I think that works really well for product. I think maybe there's something there. Maybe we need to think harder about grouping more of the marketing stuff into epics. And there's certainly like some like larger campaigns, like a big product launch or something like that, where that naturally happens, where there's a set of ebooks and webinars and other promotional stuff and other content and blog articles that kind of roll up into a, launching our new social inbox product or something like that. But I also think that there's like in every month, we publish X number of blog articles, and not all of them are necessarily, I guess we don't think about like what's the epic we could create that would tie all those together or something like that. I think it's a really good suggestion. Yeah. No, I think it's a good suggestion. I think it's a good suggestion. Yeah. And then I think the way the epic reporting works is you don't report on every epic every month or every sprint, right? So it's like when an epic finishes, now we report on epic. And that would kind of tie into yours. So maybe not every team reports every month. Maybe that's a good idea. Maybe we should think harder about that.
I think the process too reaches a certain point where, as a process, Agile is good, but at a certain point you're actually transitioning to other things like, do you have good leadership? Do you set vision that independent people can understand and follow? Can those teams have leaders that can communicate effectively up and down and transfer that vision into clear objectives? So I feel like you complicate that by trying to turn it into a scrum of scrums or force feed it into an epic, and at a certain point it just becomes like good management rather than a methodology per se.
Yeah, I definitely think that the point at which we're at right now is that I think we're focused on that, right? And myself and the 3 directors that work for me are focused on like good management and making sure the people that manage these individual teams have an idea of where we're going and roughly what they should be doing, and like they understand the priorities, and then we're relying on them to manage their teams in whatever way they see, is the best way for them. And some of them are doing Agile and want to do that, and some of them are not, right? Yeah.
Okay, so maybe, I don't know if we're bumping up against the time, like, we're trying to find an hour. You want to take 1 or 2 more questions?
I think there's one over here, so why don't we take maybe one more, and then I'd love if people can stay longer if they want to like network and chit chat. So yeah.
Just going back to those groups that you say some practice and some don't. Do you notice a difference in the quality or the velocity of throughput, or do you think that if you choose to practice this, it's fine. If you choose to practice this, it's the same?
Today, I don't think I notice a difference. I definitely, like as a whole team back when we first implemented it, it definitely made a gigantic difference. But I'll say that the teams, like I say that there's teams that aren't doing Agile, they're just not as strict as that team that I showed. But like, they have a list of stuff that they're going to do that month. Or some of them are maybe like a little bit more kind of Kanban style. They're like, okay, here's the priority list of stuff we're going to work on, and we're going to pick things off like as we have capacity. So like, I think even when I say they're not doing it, they're not that far. They're maybe a little bit far away, but they're not like really far away from it. So maybe that's why it sort of works. But no, I don't know that today, in terms of throughput or productivity, that there's a big difference. That there's a big difference between the teams. So maybe I need to think about that.
Is everyone trained in it? You know, when they come on board, these new cats that come in? No.
Back when we first started doing it, yes, we actually sent people to, Scrum training, to Agile training, like multiple people on the team. And there's 1 or 2 people on each team. Even as we first started, we had like 3 or 4 teams. There was 1 or 2 people on each team that had been trained. The same training we used to send our product development folks to. Today, no. And partly it's because I let each team kind of do what they want. If I were to force all the teams to do it, then yeah, I would send not the whole team, but like what we actually did, the whole entire team went to like an hour-long like overview, like here's how it works. It was run by one of our engineering guys, but then there were a couple of people that I sent like off-site to like full day, couple day like certification, Scrum Master certification like that. I forget exactly which one.
And was it pretty easy for them to pick it up, or?
Yeah. Oh yeah. It's all this. I don't think this stuff is that hard to pick up. I think that's kind of what people adapt to, right? It's hard to stick to it, but it's not hard to like figure out. That's what I would say. Do you agree with that, Scott? One last one.
Certainly Agile works as a process, and as a result, you've got easy ways to measure. I know HubSpot's really big on analytics and data and whatever. So given that it's sort of fallen by the wayside, how are you sort of measuring success?
So in terms of measurement of activity, I'm not sure we're measuring our activity as well as we used to, but in terms of measurement of results, we're measuring results as well or as we ever have, right? So in terms of number of leads generated and how many of those are turning into sales, like what the quality of those leads are, where they're coming from, the cost of like all that stuff, like we are hardcore about that. Okay. But I think that is a measurement that is separate from Agile, which is more about activity.
Right. Okay.
In my mind is the way that I sort of think about it. So we're definitely like we're very dedicated to measuring results. Right. But on the measurement of activity, I think that at least at my level of the organization, like that's kind of gone away for everyone because of all the stuff we've done. Interesting. Awesome.
Great.
Thank you.
Mike, thank you so much.
Thanks.